How to ollie into manuals. So manuals are probably one of the easiest tricks to do. You just lift up either your front or back wheels and roll along. But once you start to add popping a trick into a manual, it can get a little bit tricky. So before anything, if you're not too good at them, I suggest going and watching my How to Balance Manuals video. And that should help you with the basics of where to put your feet, finding the sweet spot, and how to shift your weight. So yeah, basically the first step is just to make sure you have balancing your manuals down really well. And for this video, I'm going to be using a curb as my manual pad because they're just about everywhere and probably the easiest thing to learn on. So the next thing you want to make sure you can do is ollie up onto your object. If you're at the point where you're trying to ollie into a manual, then this should be pretty easy for you. Just get to the point where ollieing up is kind of second nature and you don't really have to think about it too much. So really quick, I want to talk about foot positioning. You're basically going to set your feet up like you would for a regular ollie, except in order to help balance once you land into the manual, you may want to move your front foot up a little towards the nose. So something I would recommend before actually trying to ollie up into a manual on the curb is just trying it a few times on flat. This should be a bit easier because you don't have to ollie as high and you can focus more on your foot positioning. During this step, you can experiment with how far you need to lean your body weight over one foot or the other once you land. And you can also practice going various speeds just to see how it feels. Also, because ollieing up into a manual requires you to adapt and change your balance on the fly, it can also help to not just practice regular manuals on flat, but trying them in different situations, like dropping off a curb, going up or down a hill, or dropping your board down into a manual. So if you practice all that and you have your balance down really well, and ollieing up the curb is no problem, then it's time to actually start trying. Oh yeah, and before I proceed, I should say that you probably will scrape your tail a lot while learning this. So be prepared for that, or you can use an old board or something. So in order to get a feel for things, I would suggest ollieing up the curb and landing with your tail down. This way you can kind of get used to what it feels like to ollie up something and land with your weight all the way back. And just remember that when I say with your weight towards the back, I don't mean with your upper body leaning back, because that'll probably cause you to slip out. I just mean with more weight on your back foot than your front. Because besides that, you do want to keep your upper body centered over the board. From here, I'd say the next best thing is to kind of do the opposite, which is just to ollie up and land on all four wheels, but as quickly as you can, take it into a manual. This should help you get used to the feeling of ollieing up and then transitioning into that manual balancing position. So the interesting thing about this trick is that the ollie itself is really easy, and the balancing the manual is easy, but the main hard part is what links the two. And that's right when you land on top, making sure that your feet are in the right position with the right weight distribution, and with your upper body also shifting weight in order to balance. So really the trick to this takes place in that 1 second right when you land on top. So now that it's time to actually start trying to land into a manual without scraping or leaning too far forward, let's make sure that you're ollieing up with everything in the right position. So like I mentioned earlier, you set up like a regular ollie, but with your front foot a little more forward for balance. And then once you go to actually pop the ollie, you're not going to level it out fully like you normally would, but instead you're going to keep the nose lifted in the air like a slightly rocketed ollie. And then once you land, it's best to have your back foot near the pocket, because this will help you get into that sweet spot a lot better. Although it doesn't always work out like this, and if you do ollie up and land with your foot a little closer to the edge of the tail, you can still ride it out if you have good balance with your manuals. So from here, if you have everything down, it's just a matter of repetition. And if you notice you're scraping your tail every single time, then try to put more weight towards your front foot. And if you're just landing with your front wheels down, then try and do the opposite. Like I mentioned before, if you have your ollies and your manuals down, this trick really just takes place right when you land. It's just a matter of finding the balance and adjusting as soon as your back wheels touch. And after that, once you do touch down, you're going to want to take into account all the other basics of balancing a manual, which means sticking your arms out and using them and your upper body to balance, and slightly shifting weight between your 2 feet in order to keep the nose up. So another thing I should mention is I've just covered how to ollie into regular manuals, but almost all of the same practice steps apply to ollieing into a nose manual. You want to make sure that you're really good at balancing them first, and then you can practice ollieing into them on flat. And then little by little, as you start to take them up a curb, you can experiment with leaning a little bit more forward or back, But keep in mind that for a nose manual, if you do lean too far forward for this one, it's a lot easier to fall because you're just going to stop dead. And finally, I've only been mentioning ollieing into manuals, but this could also apply to kickflips or pretty much any other trick. So for a quick recap, make sure that you have your regular manuals on flat down really well. You should be able to balance them for a pretty good distance and understand the whole dynamic of shifting your weight. After that, you also have to make sure that you can ollie up whatever the object is that you're trying to manual on. It shouldn't be a struggle to ollie up, so you don't want to pick something too high at first. And once you have that down, start trying to ollie up and then quickly going into manual after landing. It's here that you're going to try and close the gap between ollieing and getting into a manual. And to do that, take some trial and error and some experimentation with how much weight you have on which foot and where your body weight is centered. So hopefully if this is something you want to learn, this helped you a little bit. Something that I mentioned in my first manuals video is that while I can kind of explain it to you, I can't really teach you balance over the internet. So that's something you have to work on yourself just through practice. But once you do start to get these down, it'll open up a whole new world of skating for you. So if you have any specific trick tips that you want to see, or just more in-depth explanations like this one, then let me know down below. I'd like to thank my Patreon pledgers for their continued support. And besides that, I'd like to thank you for watching, and you can like and subscribe if you want.